I know we have a few more people joining us virtually than had anticipated due to not being able to make it here, but we're very glad to have everyone who did brave the weather and joined us today in person. I have a few brief opening remarks, and then I will invite Shanti Shoji from Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA to make some brief remarks, and then we'll get started with our first panel. So first, I want to say that on behalf of International Student Conferences, it's my honor to welcome you today to the 2025 9th US Japan Korea Trilateral Symposium. For those of you who don't know me, I am Bahia Simons Lane, the Executive Director of ISC, and I'm thrilled to see such a dynamic gathering of students, experts, and stakeholders here both in person and virtually, from joining us from across the United States, and possibly a few from Japan and Korea, although given the time difference, probably not. We all know the critical importance of dialogue and collaboration between people from different countries. Since 2013, the US-Japan-Korea Trilateral Forum has been a platform for fostering mutual understanding, addressing shared challenges, and preparing the next generation of leaders to shape the future of trilateral cooperation. The symposium provides a culminating platform for the community to come together and open dialogue on current issues. Today, we focus on a thought-provoking theme. How does technology impact trilateral cooperation among the US, Japan, and South Korea? Over the course of the event today, you'll hear from distinguished policy experts and innovative student leaders, each bringing unique perspectives to the table. From emerging technologies to artificial intelligence, these discussions will highlight not only the opportunities, but also the responsibilities we share in strengthening bonds between nations. I'd like to take a moment to extend our deepest gratitude to the funders of this symposium, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA and the Korea Foundation. Your generous support and unwavering commitment to fostering trilateral cooperation have made this gathering possible, and your investment in the next generation of leaders ensures that the vital work of understanding and collaboration continues to thrive. Thank you as well for FIU and DC for hosting us again for the second year in a row for this trilateral forum. I also want to thank the United States-Japan Foundation and the Korea Foundation again for their financial support for the Trilateral Forum, which has lasted this whole week. Without their support, we would not be able to bring the Japanese and Korean student leaders to DC for this important program. So today, I encourage you all to engage actively, listen with curiosity, and contribute with an open mind. The conversations we have today and the connections we build will echo far beyond this room, shaping policies, fostering partnerships, and inspiring solutions that advance our shared vision of a more secure and prosperous future. Finally, I want to express my heartfelt thanks to our panelists, moderators, student participants, and of course, the ISC team whose dedication makes this symposium possible. Your commitment to creating spaces for dialogue and innovation is what drives this forum forward year after year. We would not be here without the student leaders. So could all the student leaders please raise your hand for all three of our conferences? ECs, executive committee members, please raise your hand. Great. So as you can see, we have a lot of them in this room today, and I hope you all have a chance, those of you who are here in person, to chat with them during the break and at the reception afterwards. All right. I now would like to welcome Shanti Shoji up to make some brief remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Bahia kindly introduced me, I'm Shanti Shoji, Director of Programs at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, or Sasakawa USA for short. And we are a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit in DC with both think tank functionalities and grant giving. We do a lot of programs that focus on the US-Japan alliance. And our mission is really to bring people together on that topic and to deepen understanding. And as if you just watch the news, we know that US-Japan is no longer just a bilateral relationship, but it's also gone into regional and really a global alliance. And so, we really find it important to continue the pipeline of students and scholars who are passionate about what our relationship looks like in the region. And we're really proud that we can offer funding and have this symposium with you all today with the Korea Foundation. And I'd like to thank Bahia for all her work as Executive Director, International Student Conferences, for bringing you all together. And I'm very excited to hear from the experts we have. Thank you so much for coming to share your time on technology within the US-Japan South Korea Alliance, but also from the students and what you've learned, and just to hear you present your ideas today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shanti. And in the handout or the trifold for today, there's information about all three organizations that made today's program possible. If you didn't pick one up yet, they're at the front. So please grab one and learn a little bit more about the work of International Student Conferences and also the Korea Foundation. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite our moderator and panelists up here. I'm not going to introduce them, and I hope that our moderator will take care of that.
Good afternoon. It's afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I got to meet some of you last night at the reception of the Korea Foundation, but in case we didn't meet, my name is Melanie Berry. I'm really thrilled to be here and to get to support this wonderful initiative, and also to be on get the chance to moderate this panel with this wonderful group of distinguished experts. So thank you again to Bahia and others at ISE for the invitation. I am a vice president at the Asia Group, which is a strategic consulting firm based here in DC and with offices throughout the Asia Pacific, where I focus mainly on US-Japan relations, US foreign policy and the Indo-Pacific broadly, and Japanese foreign policy. So I've gotten to work a little bit on Japan-Korea relations and US-Korea relations over the course of my career, and I'm very just eager to help support an initiative that promotes grassroots kind of trilateral cooperation. So that's enough about me, though. I'd like to give the chance to our panelists to give a short self-introduction before we get into the conversation.
Okay, great. My name is Kellee Wicker, and I direct the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Wilson Center, which is a quasi-governmental think tank here in DC, a fancy way of saying some of us are federal employees and some of us are not. But we have the enviable position of being able to inform the US government directly on key foreign policy topics. But for me, I sit in the tech space looking at geopolitics, as opposed to my colleagues who are sitting in the geopolitics space looking at tech. So hopefully we'll be able to have an interesting kind of dialogue here from our different perspectives.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kayla Orta. I'm the Senior Associate for Korea Research at the Wilson Center, and I am very excited, as Kellee said, to be working together to talk more about technology in this space. So obviously my work focuses on both the Koreas. I look at both North Korea and South Korea, in particular US-South Korean relations. My background is mainly in security, particularly in nuclear security, and then I have tripped and fallen into the tech space. And so today I'll be talking a little bit about nuclear energy. I'll be talking more about that energy technology and some of the ideas, because we have to be able to have the energy in place to be able to build the industry as well. So I'm very much looking forward to this. As Bahia mentioned, this is my second time being back. I'm hoping that everybody asks really great questions. So challenge us up here, because hopefully it'll be a more interesting discussion then. Yeah.
Thank you, and good afternoon. My name is Jim Schoff. I'm a senior director at Sasakawa USA, where Shanti is from, and I focus primarily on US-Japan Alliance. I run something we call the US-Japan Next Alliance Initiative, which looks at new and emerging challenges for the alliance, and technology is a big part of that. I used to work also a lot with Korea. I worked in the Defense Department for a few years, working on the Trilateral defense talks and defense trade between US, Japan, South Korea. So it's great to be a part of this discussion today. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I guess just to kick us off, I wanted to see if you had any just initial responses to the kind of primary prompt for this session, which is, how the US, Japan, and Korea are approaching, their policies regarding new technologies. In particular, are there any particular technologies, as Kayla mentioned, that you'd like to highlight as a particular focus for each of your respective countries? So Kellee, would you like to start off?
I would love to. So This is an interesting conversation to have at this moment as we're coming into a new administration and a new Congress, and we're apparently rethinking all of our allied relationships, including our continental ones. And so I think it'll be difficult to kind of talk about what really do we expect looking forward. But I think I'm going to be the really boring person that everyone has in every event now who comes in with the AI stuff. We're not allowed to have any event without talking about AI. But I think in this relationship particularly, it's very important. We saw when Japan had the G7 presidency that AI was a key policy objective for them. Everyone kind of is viewing this as a place to stake their flag. There's two things ahead for this relationship, I think, in the AI space. One is working together to curb the Chinese version of how to use AI, what AI should be used for, what it empowers. China has a very control-based, surveillance-based use of AI, whereas the United States has a much more freedom and human rights-oriented use of it. And this is something that I always enjoy talking with Japan and Korea experts. Those two countries kind of occupy a strange middle space where there's a lot more comfort with some of those surveillance uses of AI than we see in the United States, but there is still more alignment with the way the United States thinks of AI. I expect the G7 to, with Canadian presidency now, to continue working on making sure that democratic values are what drives AI governance globally. But we need to keep figuring out, how do we win hearts and minds of the global South, who's really not aligned with either approach to AI? How do we help make sure that they are able to participate in this future tech-enabled world? And how do we make sure that when they participate with this democratic underpinnings of the technology? At the same time, there is this weird introduction of new competition within the relationship. Everybody's kind of smiling in a photo together while they're pinching each other behind their backs. We're all fighting for the same computer chips. We're all fighting for the same data. We're all fighting for control of these inputs that are limited in quantity. And so while we have this uniting specter of China in the background, we're also jockeying for position with one another, which is not great. And this, the United States sometimes loses sight of the fact that we are not going to be in the lead forever. Just because the companies that are driving this revolution are headquartered here doesn't change the fact that many of the workers and thinkers that have led this revolution are not originally American thinkers. And that's especially pertinent, I think, to think about right now as we see this return to this America First ideology in terms of scholarship. I am concerned, frankly, about what the competition for compute is going to do to relationships like this trilateral one, where there has been kind of a fraught history, let's say, between the three countries. And then, of course, looking outside of the AI lens, for me, when I think about this relationship, I also always think, my husband's in the Air Force, and he was stationed in Korea for a year, and then we were in Okinawa for 3 years. And so I've seen firsthand this uneasy relationship with the American military presence in these countries. And when you think about national security uses of technology, we have to think not just what are we willing to use and how we're willing to use it, but also how do the countries that are housing our troops, how do they feel? I can tell you how the Okinawans feel about the Ospreys. But I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of these new questions come up.
Excellent. Well, I also I took a little bit of a different approach with some of this, and it mainly because I have an article I'll be coming out with NBR's Asia policy looking into energy technology. So what I thought I might do is give a little bit of input into that and kind of build on what Kellee has done. She's placed the landscape for us, and talk about a couple of specifics that might be interesting for those who are curious about emerging technologies linked to some of these rapidly expanding but high costing industries additionally. So a lot of my work, as I mentioned, is on the security side, but you cannot talk about security without talking about economics, right? I think a lot of you hear this constantly. This is the theme in Washington and in DC these days, is that there's this reintroduction of interdisciplinary conversation. So we can't have security without having economics. But I think what often gets missed is that energy question, right? So especially for those who are thinking about security, if you're looking at nuclear, are you also talking nuclear energy? Are you thinking about that dynamic? And if we're thinking about the United States and their context around their industry buildup, but then we're also talking about our allies in different regions, are they import dependent on energy? And so we've got to have some of this dynamic coming through, and we're thinking about securing supply chains. We need to be thinking about some of the other spaces there. So a couple of interesting thoughts for us that I think, and in particular, I will say that even though we're going to 2025 and it's going to be a different political environment, different political space, there are a lot of opportunities here. And I'm going to say that because even if we don't have at the top leadership buy-in for every single one of these platforms, there already are industry growth in these sectors. So there's three places that I think we can look with a bit of optimism. So first is the expansion of liquefied natural gas, so LNG exports. The United States has really been able to step up and fill the gap that Russia has had because of its invasion in Ukraine. Now that those numbers might go down a little bit, but that is an area that South Korea and Japan have really tapped into because they do not have the ability to rely on Russia. And there's also some linkages with Australia in that space. Civil nuclear energy, this is where I really enjoy doing research. So if anybody's curious about the intersectionality of security and technology and the opportunities but threats that also lay there, thinking about South Korea's own conversations about going nuclear. But there is some interesting crossover between the United States, South Korea, and Japan, which are all leading nuclear energy producers. I think they represent the first, the sixth, and the seventh of the nuclear energy producers in the world. So they are huge in that space. There's a lot of opportunity for development and growth. And then lastly, hydrogen. Hydrogen has really emerged in recent years as a very interesting conversation. Now, very much like nuclear, there are those who are very pro the concept of exploring, and there are those who say it's too costly, doesn't make any sense, we shouldn't be going that direction. Well, whatever we think here in the United States, Japan and Korea have really helped push the forefront of the landscape around hydrogen infrastructure. So in Japan, they started their own, the hydrogen basic strategy back in 2017, and they've been growing that domestically. South Korea had their own congressional act on hydrogen development and safety and maintenance, and that was in 2020. So these countries are really pushing the forefront. Korea, obviously, it's fuel cells, is looking at hydrogen-powered vehicles, and Japan has done more exploration in steel making and thinking about how to utilize hydrogen. But the United States has also been curious in recent years, and there's been a push thanks to the Infrastructure Act, to be able to develop hydrogen in the U.S. as well as ports and other conversations. So I think if we're trying to build out this picture of what can be possible moving forward, these are some fun specifics, and I'm happy to go into a little bit more if people are interested in any one of the above. But they're definitely examples of areas where individually these three countries are working hard on their own industry and they need them domestically. And you could argue that even though there has been high-level rhetoric, thinking Camp David Summit, energy is mentioned in those spaces, we don't really see a separate energy dialogue space, unlike how we have with the United States and Korea has bilateral energy security dialogue. Japan developed that as well. And so we don't really have a trilateral one. I know there's been some flirting with this idea in the past maybe 10 months, there was a little bit of flirting on the South Korea side and a little bit of the US dropping hints, but we don't really see it coming to the forefront when I think it's an opportunity that really should be there. And even though it's mentioned in other dialogues and forums. So I hope that that gives a couple of specifics. I can't share the article yet. It is still in process. It's supposed to be out in January, so I was hoping to be able to have copies, but eventually it'll be with NBR, and they've been really wonderful to host some of these conversations also on trilateral engagement. So yeah, and I think I'll stop there.
Terrific. Well, this gives me an opportunity to step back for a second. And if I look at the question, how does U.S.-Japan trilateral cooperation play a role in technology decisions? I think it's important first to emphasize that from a U.S. perspective, this is all being seen through the lens of strategic competition with China. And it's got heavily military, geostrategic, geoeconomic implications. That is true also to some extent, I think, for Japan and South Korea. Maybe a little bit more for Japan than South Korea. But both of them also have strong an economic lens or a trade and local relationship, regional relationship lens that they're also looking at this with. So, so that adjusts or changes to some extent the priorities and the tools or the policies that we pursue. So even though our policy approaches and sometimes our interests diverge a little bit, the good news, though, overall, is that we largely agree on what technologies are most important. If you look at various statements among the leaders, it's computing technology, semiconductor chips, AI, quantum computing, biotechnology, and then green technology are the most mentioned. And I would add probably space technologies as well, even though that often doesn't get mentioned. We coordinate heavily on protection of emerging technologies, high technologies, and promotion. So it tends to get, our policies get divided into those two categories. We have some good bilateral mechanisms for helping us manage these things, especially on export control coordination, which is very complicated in the semiconductor space and keeps changing all the time. In the US-Japan context, we have the Economic Policy Consultative Committee, or the EPCC, or what we call the Econ 2+2. On the Korea side, we have the US-ROC Next Generation Critical and Emerging Technologies Dialogue, as well as a US-Korea supply chain and commercial dialogue. There's a variety of bilateral initiatives to coordinate supply chain, export controls, investment restrictions, and the like. We finally had our first trilateral meeting of the Commerce and Industry Ministers in 2024. How much of that will continue under the Trump administration, I'm not sure. I expect the bilateral to continue because it's so important to coordinating our policies. But I think the multilateral or the minilateral side of managing all of this may be less of a priority for a Trump administration. We'll see. It can be useful, though. Overall, though, I expect things to get harder in the next few years with the Trump administration. It's already been getting harder under the latter stages of the Biden administration in terms of pushing the envelope on this strategic competition lens of how to restrict technologies and build walls around the research and development and the like-minded countries that we share these technologies with. I think that's going to become a little bit harder to manage going forward. The other thing I want to mention is on the promotion side, we've had a variety of initiatives to put money and build new relationships among national laboratories and others behind new technologies. It's important to remember that 80% or so of the research and development spending that happens in the United States and in Japan and Korea, even more so in Japan and Korea, comes from the private sector. So the governments can have an impact, but it's mostly the private sector that's doing this. And on the US side, it's huge numbers. We spend over $800 billion a year here in the United States on research and development. And the top 5 US companies, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, Microsoft, Apple, spend more than all of Japan on research and development. Over $200 billion, just those 5 companies. So the private sector is going to be a key player, and we've seen a lot of cross-border investment. I'm concerned about the Nippon Steel investment being blocked, but there's a lot both coming in from Korea and Japan into the United States, and AWS and Microsoft and others going to Japan and South Korea as well. So so that's maybe where I'll focus, but I'm very interested to talk also about the AI piece and governance. We took a group this summer of US AI researchers from national labs to Japan to meet with counterparts there and talk about AI safety, AI security. And that's one area I totally agree that we're going to have challenges in terms of how we view the priorities of governance from a commercial side, even also from a national security perspective or an ethical perspective. But perhaps among US, Japan, South Korea, at least, and the rest of the G7 or G8, quasi G8, this AI safety, AI security, countering disinformation, there are underlying technologies there that I think we all have an interest in, whether it's testing an evaluation of AI models, or it's data governance and data sharing, or other types of research and development partnerships. That's an area I see some potential for.
All right, thank you. So I guess picking up at that on that last point, and I think you both sort of touched on this briefly, but with many of these new technologies, we're seeing, I think all three countries begin to view them in a policy sense through the lens of national security. So do you for all three of you, do you see the United States, Japan, and Korea kind of similarly viewing each of these technologies from a national security lens? Are there gaps in how important they view some of these new technologies to national security? And then what is the balance, I think, for each of, just given, I think, the predominance of US companies in R&D and in many of these specific industries, how are they looking at balancing between wanting to foster national champions or wanting to rely on domestic companies for certain sensitive systems or things like that, with, wanting to, attract some of the major players to their market and be kind of a very integrated kind of international relationship system. So I don't know if you have any immediate responses to that, but any thoughts are welcome.
Turn myself up. And I think you kind of touched on this a little bit. If we have this weird situation where the private sector are essentially geopolitical players that are not controlled by any one government, which puts us in a really weird position, because at any point in time, Meta or Apple or anybody can make a decision that has wildly huge geopolitical implications, and we actually can't do anything about it. They may be headquartered here, but they are operating everywhere. I think particularly thinking about Meta's decision to remove content moderation, people are talking about that like it's an American free speech decision. I'm not sure how aligned it is with that, but it certainly is a decision that impacts every country except for Europe, because they have laws requiring content moderation. But what Meta decides has enormous ramifications for how people can speak with one another, how bad actors can plan things, and not to say that is what is naturally going to happen as a result of that decision. But, these are decisions that are being made by people who are not elected officials of any country. And so there's only so much that trilateral unification on a topic can do about certain technology capabilities. But one thing I think is really interesting on this question of national champions versus international players, both Japan and Korea have a regulatory sandbox for emerging tech. I love regulatory sandboxes. If you follow me around DC, I will talk about it most of the time. But it's really fascinating because this term essentially has not been defined, and everyone has a totally different definition for it. In some countries, the sandbox is being created so that we can test regulations. How do we regulate AI without killing it? How do we regulate batteries without slowing it down? In other countries, like Japan and Korea, it's actually a mechanism that helps startups. It's not really there to help regulation get created. It is there to help startups have an environment where they're not on the hook for expensive legal compliance early in the process of developing a technology. They have created these in this way because Japan and Korea are prioritizing making a more thriving startup ecosystem. They see what we have in the United States with these behemoth companies coming out of, spun off of MIT or started in Silicon Valley, and they'd like that to happen in their countries as well. This is one of the mechanisms they do that. It's not the only one. There's lots of different investments. And I'm probably overstepping my expertise here and let the regional experts talk about that more. But I think that's being paired with courting these multinational companies who, again, are their own geopolitical powers. It is in your interest to have them in your borders so that you can at least have some kind of economic levers you can push with them, and you can bring them in and talk to them as an official of a country where they are located. I think it takes both. You have to have both. Particularly because a startup ecosystem is just, how do you make a national champion? That's a question that if we could answer that, we would be in charge of everything.
Maybe I'll jump in with a couple of, I think the conversation about national champions is particularly interesting in Asia. And so you said for the regional context, Korea, obviously the chaebol industries, and so thinking about large corporations, long legacies, long-term thinking investment strategy as well. But I did want to come back to the point, Melanie, you raised about thinking through, are we in alignment when it comes to security, and particularly in the region, and thinking through the kind of national perspective. And the tricky part here is that even though everyone in DC will be talking about public-private cooperation and communication, obviously there's also competition within these sectors and these spaces. So when we think about where can US, South Korea, and Japan in a political sense see eye to eye, there's going to be areas that they can agree upon when it comes to securing technology and supply chain, but they aren't going to see maybe the same threat dynamic in the same way that maybe the US does. So we do historically see a difference in South Korea of how they view China versus the United States. We don't know what's going to happen moving forward in South Korea, but if we see a return of a liberal government, maybe they will be a bit softer on China. That has historically happened in recent years. And so we can say that there are moments that are going to be politically aligned, but there's also going to be areas that's not quite. So the Wilson Center in 2023, we did a senior level congressional commission, an expert commission. And when we took a look at what they were saying is a lot of the concern between the Korea and Japan difference with the United States was specifically this question about where is the biggest threat in the region. And if you're not sitting in Asia, then what is it that the perspective on the difference there? And so I think the point about competition and cooperation is going to be really interesting. Also thinking about just the difference in the way the industry is structured as well. So one really good example here, and it might be coming to a close eventually, but looking at the issues between KEPCO and Westinghouse on the nuclear side. So obviously this was in the news a lot this fall, thinking of Czechia and being able to bid and thinking about where's the future of nuclear energy and countries that are not just the leading nuclear energy producers. But here's a really good example of a kind of national champions kind of leading the forefront of this technology and development outside the country, but then clashing and competition, and then a difference in how far the United States can make pressure on their own sectors versus where can there be pressure politically done in Korea or Japan. That's a little bit different, right? It's a bit of a cozier relationship in that sense there than we have in the US. So we can only apply so much political pressure. We also have to show that it's competitively in that company and that industry's best interest to cooperate or to work together in these different sectors. So I think we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I did want to flag because I think it's an interesting conversation.
Great. And I'll just add on this issue of alignment. It's a good question. I think within our countries, we have a lot of disagreement about what the priorities should be and how to go about this. So I totally agree. Japan is trying to, they look at AWS and Microsoft investing a lot of money in new data centers in Japan, providing those types of services. The Japanese government is turning to some of these companies to help provide, even in the national security sector, much against their desire, because they worry about national security or confidentiality, but they don't have other options. It's either get the best product available and the best service available, or have it just be a Japanese producer. So they're trying to accommodate that, and there are disagreements within Japan about how much to invest to fix that, what's the right strategy, et cetera. I still believe, because I used to work in the private sector and with a lot of joint ventures between US and Japanese firms, I feel like joint ventures or private sector collaboration may be an opportunity to help bridge some of that gap. And on the other side as well, in terms of Japan investing in US defense industry, as opposed to trying to just build their own capability there, and joint ventures in some of these high technology spaces. We see it in the semiconductor manufacturing space. A big project in Japan is the Rapidus program, multi-billion-dollar investments by the government to create a new semiconductor manufacturing company to produce at 2-nanometer level up in Hokkaido. They're moving along in close partnership with IBM. It's an IBM design. And so I think there's some great potential there. But I also think it's worth mentioning the definition of economic security is beginning to expand. Right? So it used to be this idea of a small yard, high fence. We're just going to identify a couple of things, a couple of technologies, the most important, and we're going to build a really high fence around them. But that yard is getting bigger, and it's increasingly looking like members of Congress or incoming Trump administration people will look at data as a critical component to protect. Um, it, TikTok is all about that in this context. So that's going to be another fracture point or friction point, I think, between U.S., Japan, South Korea. If we start expanding the definition of economic security, I think it makes that harder. And then finally, China gets a vote in all of this as well. China's retaliated against some of the U.S. Chip semiconductor export control restrictions and investigations with export restrictions of gallium or graphite or other types of materials that are important for producing semiconductors. In the beginning, they put notional limits on export controls for any country, but they didn't really enforce them. So this was last year or so that there were these restrictions put in, but you didn't see a big change in the export control. It was more like a shot, like a warning shot. But the most recent restrictions that came out were just focused on the United States. So what if then China says, if you want to join the U.S., talking to South Korea and Japan, if you want to join them in putting restrictions on us, you can join our list of export bans and see how your, all the billions that you're investing in your semiconductor industry manage to survive that. So, so this searching for pressure points or coordinating to alleviate and to really stick together. Personally, I think the U.S. should stick with the small yard high fence. It's a much easier way to get broader trilateral cooperation, but I don't know as if it's always going to be that way. So it may have to be technology by technology or decision by decision.
Great, thank you. I guess, Kellee, I had a question specifically for you, but of course, Kayla and Jim, you're welcome to jump in. But specifically with regard to how the U.S. views its partnerships with Japan and Korea, and as well as the trilateral partnership within the context of global technology policy. I think especially, given how kind of forward-leaning Europe has been with regard to actually putting, legislation, hard regulations in place. So how do you see kind of the U.S. viewing its partnerships with Japan and Korea to shape sort of the global technology governance ecosystem?
I think one of the things that will make it easier for us to work with Japan in particular, but Korea as well, is that they are not approaching it with the same EU. The EU is very much like, we're going to have overarching framework laws. We're going to have very specific things that we're regulating. We're going to regulate everything. Whereas Japan has definitely taken the same approach we have. It's like, look, we're going to have voluntary stuff. We're going to work with the industry. We're going to set principles, but we're not really going to make this huge framework. I tend to agree with that approach personally, not just because I'm American, but because, this technology is so fast changing. By the time the EU AI Act is in full force, the technology will have changed so much that probably a lot of it will be irrelevant. Why take all the time to put into place a law that is irrelevant as soon as it's passed? So I think the Japanese and American approach of it, often it's accused of being toothless or overly industry friendly, and it possibly is overly industry friendly. There is very much kind of, we're like, I don't know, you figure it out, which we saw how well that worked with social media. It was wonderful. So we may be in for some surprises with this approach, but I think in general, it is the smarter approach of those two, assuming those are the two options. It's not a dichotomy, but we're pretending it is for a minute. I think, and this is where I'm going to look at Kayla a little bit. My impression is that Korea has kind of had a similar approach to the way that they've worked with industry and the way that they've been regulating. I don't think that they're interested in these grand sweeping legislations, but you tell me.
I'll jump in just a little bit, but no, Korea it really is about, we can think about large sweeping policy. It's not the same thing in Korea where it is with Europe. And so in Korea, you do see more industry focus, and so we'll see it in the legislative space. You'll see it more coming from different presidential administrations, particularly how they're building out their ministry for the different topic and area, and as well as the research. And you'll have it kind of trickle down from there. Korea more recently has been trying to push for a bigger conversation around public-private partnership and trying to bring that in also with U.S. partners. So we have seen several forums and symposiums bringing in large, U.S. companies that have already been mentioned to work with South Korean companies and have conversation in some of these spaces. Hydrogen has obviously been huge on their agenda. So that's a really good example there. But I think you're completely right. It's a little bit different in Asia where you don't have sweeping policy, but you do have very large industry leaders, and you do have those national champions in those sectors, and the partnership between the government and the different government branches, as well as the research and development with that industry leader, has to be quite well articulated and close, but it's not the same way as it's sweeping. Yeah.
Can I just ask, in Korea, do they use the term soft law? Sometimes in Japan, they'll differentiate an approach between, well, there's hard law and there's soft law. Or administrative guidance, but there's flexibility. Do they use that term in Korea?
I haven't heard that term more explicitly. I do know that it can be quite interesting to see how it, especially if we think about kind of emerging and leading technology, there has been some complaints in recent years in Korea, especially thinking hydrogen and some of the other ones, about how that policy does trickle down and how it's communicated. And it can appear a bit of a black box. I know several US companies have wanted to break into some of these spaces and have come a knock-in and said, okay, can you please interpret this? What are they actually saying here? When they're putting a call out for hydrogen development, okay, how do they delineate between gray, green, and blue? What is their calculation there? And finding that regulation and information is not always as precise. And that has been a recent criticism by a lot of the industry, both in South Korea and in the US, because if they want to be able to break in, there needs to be more clarification. So what murky would be is an answer to that. So I wouldn't say there's so much as a soft or hard, but I've heard more of the kind of the murkiness and sometimes.
All right, thank you. So I guess looking forward, we have interesting political situations in three of these countries, upcoming transition in the United States, some political uncertainty in South Korea, an election coming up next year, another election coming up next year in Japan. So what do you see as some of the main challenges to effective kind of trilateral cooperation on these technology issues over the course of the next 3 to 4 years in the near term?
Go back the other way. So on this issue specifically, I've thought a lot about it lately, and my big takeaway is ever since the Camp David summit and even a little bit before that, there's been a big investment in trying to promote trilateralism as what I would call an ism, as an institution, or to institutionalize or to lock in kind of these patterns of collaboration, because it's something that had existed quite regularly for many years. When I was in the Pentagon, this was when Yeonpyeong-do was being attacked, the Chonan was being sunk, and China was taking North Korea's side, and Japan and the US and South Korea were really coming close together. And then it kind of fell apart for many years, and we got this opportunity to kind of recapture it, and there was this effort to promote it as almost like a strategy, and an ism. And I guess my instinct would be, I don't know as if it will survive as an ism from the US perspective, or under the other pressures that it will face in both South Korea and Japan, but that at the practical level, for each incoming assistant secretary or undersecretary coming in now, these mechanisms that we've produced are very useful, very practical, very productive. They help them get things done. We share so many interests, common interests. We have so many good connections and capabilities that I think the value of these in their kind of dismembered parts will do just fine if we don't put a big spotlight on them necessarily as a strategic obligation or somehow an expectation of an entire nation or of another government. So that's my big recommendation looking forward on this question, but there are probably pros and cons to that.
I guess we're going back this direction this time then. I will say it's a little unfortunate. A lot of the policies we have been seeing a lot of effort in recent years, particularly think about IPEF and things like that have really tried to push economic and other policies and technology policies as well. Most of the people I talk to in DC, it's pretty much understood IPEF is dead. So it's kind of the way that the language is. Now, that is not to say that there aren't elements and ties and connections embedded in that process in recent years that won't continue forward. I mean, obviously, you know, Jim had mentioned excellently the huge amount of investment coming into the United States into key sectors and industries. That's still going to be there. That will be moving forward. So even though I think there's a bit of maybe more concern about Trilateral as a high functioning political platform that gets a lot of TV time and conversation time, maybe that starts to go down. I don't think we'll see a complete disjunct or breaking up of the industry cooperation and partnership in that sense. There are some things that are already moving. It's a train that's moving forward. I will say that the situation in Korea, it leaves quite a lot of uncertainty. We weren't expecting this type of uncertainty this soon for all of us who work on the Korea front. And so if we do see a political shift and change, we have found that as Korea becomes increasingly divided, particularly in the partisanship landscape, that certain policies that historically maybe weren't linked to a particular party are now increasingly linked. And so, you know, with the Moon Jae-in administration, that was, you know, it was their nuclear reversal policy. So it's trying to close down those nuclear plants, kind of reducing that whole industry. Now, this is a huge industry in Korea. So, I mean, if you go to Daejeon and you go to like some of the nuclear facilities and research spaces, you know, this is a whole complex. There's a humongous amount of educated individuals and energy and time and legacy that's been in that space, and to have that reversal slowing it all down, I think it will be quite interesting to see how that is vocalized again, because now that they've had the re-ramp up, if it starts to go back again, I think that's not fair for the industries. And I think you'll find a lot more people vocalizing that concern more adamantly potentially in those spaces. But obviously it's hard to do much as an individual. It's more about government policy. But I think there are spaces we can be quite hopeful for when it comes to the industry shift, even if politically we don't have the same maybe lip service. And that maybe also could be a good thing. A lot can get pushed across the threshold sometimes without politicians I'm doing a lot of the talking. So when industry takes the lead in some of these spaces, it can be helpful, but we'll have to see for a little bit of it. Yeah.
I'm not going to repeat all the things that I agree with that were just said. So what I'm going to focus on is I think it's going to be really important in the coming years for people who are advocates for the importance of this relationship to get very good at talking about what's in it for the United States. What do we get from having a strong trilateral relationship? And like be able to say specifically, economically, we get this, innovation wise, we get this, security wise, we get this. What's in it for us? I talk about this in the domestic sense. Sometimes people, when I talk to tech experts, I try to tell them, you know, when you talk to Congress, make it about their constituents. And they're like, well, that's so small. Okay, well, their job is to advocate for their constituents. You can't blame them for doing that. Similarly, this what's in it for us approach, like, you know, to an extent, that is what our government is here to do. What is in it for the United States? Why is this worth our time and our money and putting ourselves out there and risking things? And so we can't just rely on people to understand that this traditional alliance is a really important one. You have to make it explicit what is important about it. And then secondly, for this group in particular, I think I would emphasize the importance of these cultural relationships, these student level relationships, the understanding that we have of one another as people. We've seen this severing of this tie between the United States and China, and it really concerns me. We went from having 35,000 American students studying abroad in China to having like 350. That's startling and horrifying because it means when you read the news, you're not reading that with the context of the Americans and Chinese that you know. You're just reading it with the context of these faceless machines making decisions. And so creating these connections between our countries, creating these connections between our cultures, learning to understand what is it that drives the way that your government makes decisions? What is it that drives the way these businesses make decisions? Those relationships underpin, maybe not right now the trilateral, but the future of the trilateral. And so I think it's really important for those of us who are advocates of this relationship to be spending time investing in those connections. It's not always political and economic. Sometimes it's just people. And this kind of gathering is the way that we bring new life into these conversations.
I feel like that does provide a nice segue to open up to the audience for any questions, unless the panel has any last comments or that was very nice. So, let's see. Here, sorry. Yes, thanks. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Thank you all very much for your presentation. It was very informative. I had a question. This kind of came up in a couple of points, kind of this push and pull between these kinds of big sweeping state legislative moments and kind of leaders of state collaborating, and then this push and pull between industry and state as well. And so one thing I've been thinking about is the idea of like GSOMIAs or these kinds of large state traditional security information sharing, and how that might transform as we talk more about, I guess, more modern interpretations of what security looks like in a trilateral sense. So thinking about economic security, technology security, IP, and I'm really curious about your thoughts on how this might develop.
Yes. Bringing up information sharing, maybe think about this is one of those areas, and improved use of technology internally can really help us. With even our strongest alliances like NATO, for instance, or Five Eyes, even more intense, sometimes where we really break down the information pipelines or our ability to work with one another is on trust that you can keep that information from being captured by bad actors. And so I think this is going to be a part of any relationship. So the question, if Japan, Korea, and the United States can all individually, internally improve their cybersecurity through improved use of new technologies, it makes it easier for us to know when I tell Korea a piece of information, it's not going to immediately become a North Korean asset. And that's going to be really important. I think that's always in the background of these national security decisions is when I do something for you, is it for you or is it going to go to a bad actor as a result of some kind of loophole you've got or some kind of insecurity that you have inside your systems? That's a boring answer to an interesting question, but I think it's a really important thing for us to be thinking about is technology isn't always just drone warfare and nuclear plants and AI taking over the world. Sometimes it's just like, is your email secure? Okay, good.
Can I add to that? You know, to touch on Kelly's point about what do we get out of it or what's in it for us. This is a good area if the trust level can be satisfied, which is a constant issue, and there are a variety of legislative steps and bureaucratic steps in Japan, certainly, and with Korea to try to improve the reliability on that front. But if you have that, for example, sharing missile defense, real-time missile defense data, tracking this and that, you can tell an American constituent or a congressman, your investment in this one Aegis ship that can help track missiles now is tripled because there's a Japanese version of that ship and a Korean version of that ship, and all their information is coming together, and we're sharing it all, and we're all benefiting from that. That's a hard security issue. Now I would take it to the commercial side and the economic security side, because we've created all of these new rules and laws that target entities, right? We have the entity list. We have lists of companies that are collaborating with the Chinese military and this and that. And we have tariffs on certain things. And we have questions about, well, when that product goes to Vietnam, is it actually coming from China, or is it coming from here, or is this company related to that company that is blacklisted, but this company is not? And so there's a commercial intelligence side of things that I think Japan and Korea can really benefit the United States, or a division of labor at least, because we all touch the Chinese elephant in different parts, and we will benefit from sharing that kind of information. But we have not even begun to really coordinate at a commercial intelligence level on trying to oversee or implement all of the new kind of rules that we're putting out there.
Actually, a good point about the commercial intelligence side. I think we unfortunately maybe saw some of the hiccups with some of that when it comes to the CHIPS Act, right? So there was a lot of pushback in industry saying that this is not something that could be shareable. But I think obviously if it's among allies, and this comes back to the conversation point earlier about competition versus cooperation, is there ways and avenues that can still be beneficial in the supply chain and managing some of that? I also wanted to mention for Kelly's great point about it. I just also remembered there's the United States and South Korea have it's like stop the ransomware, hashtag stop ransomware, because Korea kept having problems with North Korea ransomware situations. And so it was the US and South Koreans agencies, they came together and they started like hashtag stop ransomware. And it was trying to help in both countries and awareness about the ransomware situation in North Korea. And that's a really good example. It seems very small. It seems minute. Coming back to the question, I think that was excellently put about what some of this outside or new thinking, outside the box thinking, and that was one of them. And yeah, and the other thing I thought would maybe to mention here would be kind of interesting to your point and question, if we're thinking outside the box, we're often talking Asia, Northeast Asia. What about Southeast Asia? What about South Asia? How do all these other countries play into the mix? Are there ways that South Korea, Japan, the US can lead by example that brings us closer together, but also unites us within the region? Obviously, if we were talking about combating China's influence, Southeast Asia is going to be increasingly important. And so if we're thinking a little bit through some of the technology cooperation or economic cooperation more broadly, that's kind of putting the question a bit more back there a little bit in the sense of what other places in the region should we be paying attention to when it comes to industry development.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Oh, we can go here. Sorry.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask if anyone could expand on the factors that limit expansion of nuclear energy production, and also how that will relate to the expanded needs of power for AI data centers, especially as we see like Microsoft trying to restart 3 Mile Island. Thank you.
I'll jump in first. I'll jump in, but I'd love to hear also Jim as well on the Japan side additionally. So when you think about how countries enter into the space when it comes to nuclear energy development, they do, especially when working with the United States, have to sign a 123 agreement. They also cooperate with the IAEA. And so these are all different things that are in place to limit the potential non-civil use of nuclear energy development. We do have a very clear history of countries leveraging nuclear latency or nuclear technology for security purposes, or to even break out into like nuclear weapons program, think North Korea. So there's a lot of limitations that are placed on different countries with different purposes. But of course, what's interesting about the dialogue when it comes to South Korea and Japan is that they haven't necessarily followed the same historical track. So when thinking about how Japan developed its relationship with nuclear energy with the United States, they were in a very different economic and political place than South Korea was when they were also developing. So even though the histories match, economically, South Korea in the 1960s is very different than South Korea in the 1990s and South Korea today. So one thing you'll constantly hear in South Korea is that they don't have the ability to further enrich uranium. So there is a cap on uranium enrichment, and there's also a cap on plutonium as well. Obviously, many countries have caps. What's interesting is Japan doesn't have the same with plutonium. So you'll hear in South Korea this debate about what can be done. Should South Korea have something that matches Japan? You'll also hear in Japan say that they're very concerned about plutonium stockpiling. The IAEA is concerned about this as well. And so there's a lot of conversations about fairness in these dynamics, as well as thinking about how these partnerships and agreements get implemented and how the safeguards are established. The one thing I'll say also is kind of interesting, coming back to Kelly's great points, when thinking about AI technology and cybersecurity, is Korea, as a leading industry for nuclear energy, has put a lot more effort into talking about cybersecurity. So they actually have facilities, and I mentioned in Peicheon in the complex, where they talk about physical security of nuclear power plants. How do you make sure nuclear power plants stay safe? This is also a conversation we see more in Ukraine, thinking about leveraging of nuclear power plants during an active conflict. But South Korea has more recently talked to us about cybersecurity. So how do you protect these spaces? So obviously, as moving forward in these industries, we will see a larger need for energy, and this might be why we see a little bit of a branching into hydrogen or other sectors of exploration. There will continue to be caps and limitations unless agreements are changed. And so I kind of gave you a list of different debates, but I'm happy to talk after if you have a specific question in mind that you wanted to unpack as well.
I would just add, I went to a talk yesterday by a Japanese energy expert who is previewing the early draft of Japan's 7th energy strategic plan or strategic energy plan, which will come out relatively soon. And it was interesting to note, I think the previous version was 2020 or so it's maybe been about 4 or 5 years. And nuclear went from being a phase out kind of as soon as feasible to a maximize as much as feasible as a carbon neutral base load resource. So it's still politically sensitive, but both in terms of overseas markets and domestically, there probably will be a policy change of supporting especially small modular reactor technology in the near future. We'll see.
Can I chime in with just the data center side of things? I am pumped that we're back to nuclear power. Like all we needed was an excuse, apparently. But I think it's really important to think about the long timeline of standing up new resources and the ease with which we can stand up dirty sources. And so tech companies are going to take the easy way out. They're going to probably say, we're going to do renewables, we're going to do nukes, all of those things take a long time, particularly in countries where you have a lot of permitting and regulations. So for instance, the data center that Elon Musk built in Shelby County, Tennessee was in partnership with the Tennessee Valley Authority to have renewable power. Whole thing was going to take 10 years. It still is going to take 10 years. So he just plopped a massive natural gas generator down there to run it with no approval from the county or from the city or even consultation. Is that legal? No. Does he have the money to pay the fines? Yes. So he's going to do it. So I think we're going to see a lot of this as well. Like we're going to talk about nukes, we're going to talk about renewables, then we're going to actually do whatever it takes to get the power and compute that we need, which is regrettable. I think there was one company was the same data center that they build in Laos versus like Denmark. The one that gets built in Europe has 98% renewables powering it. The one that gets built in Laos has 4%. So even if we start standing up these cleaner power sources, when it becomes onerous and expensive, and it will, they will just build them somewhere where they don't have to do that, like India or like all these, the South Asian countries that you talked about. So I think it's gonna be really important for leaders like the US, Korea, and Japan to advocate on behalf of those countries and hold those companies accountable for where they're gonna get their power.
All right. Can I go back to this side, then I'll come back over here.
Thank you so much. Great discussion. I wanted to ask about like who would take the biggest initiative when it comes to the trilateral discussion, particularly in terms of AI stuff. Like again, as all the panels have discussed here, I also strongly agree like an importance of AI discussion among these three countries. And then you guys also talked about the shared interest and the difference in the interest in these three countries. So when it comes to the trilateral dialogues, like as Mr. Schoff said, like we had the trilateral meeting back in the fall in last year, right? Like when it comes to the trilateral meeting, who would take the biggest initiative? It can be analysis on the personal character of each leaders, like Ishiba or like Trump 2.0, or maybe I don't know if we can say it Yoon, or but so who would take the biggest initiative here?
I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say South Korea. Only because on the AI area, not being officially in the G7 process, although they're going to be included, I think, a lot, they need to take the initiative to get themselves more front and center in that dialogue.
I might add just really quick on the Korea side. If it was 2 months ago, I would also have said Korea would be leading in this space, particularly on the AI. Obviously, we saw the Democracy Summit and a lot of conversation. Even though Korea is not leading in AI industry, they seem to be wanting very clear to lead in AI policy making. They want to be a voice in that space. And I think they've done a very good job of carving out a niche in cooperation with other nations there. when it comes to trilateral and think about where is that enthusiasm pulling from, historically, it's very much the United States that is pushing the fold. So the idea of kind of completing the triangle, strengthening the last branch of it. South Korea, particularly with the Yoon administration, really went out and tried to make this a huge part of their platform. So many of us who are looking back at November and thinking through what's going to happen in 2025, is trilateral going to survive? I think a lot of people would have put quite a lot in the hat that said Yoon would be pushing it forward. Now with where we are today, there's going to be some question marks to what's going to be moving forward. And I think that's why I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of hope about this industry cooperation and partnership, because these are trains that are already on the track, they're already moving forward, whether that's FDI coming into the United States or cooperation that's already happening, thinking about information sharing on the military side and the trilateral exercises. These are things that are already institutionalized, coming back to the creation of the ISM, I think you mentioned before, but it is going to be very difficult to know if that energy is still going to be on the Korea front in particular.
I think the question defer to you guys on Japan and Korea, but for the United States, I think it comes down to, does the new administration view our leadership in this international space as the way to make sure the United States is who makes the decisions, or do they view this as a waste of our time because we're sovereign and we need to come back home in America first? I think right now we have viewed it as the one who is leading the international discussion as the one who's in charge globally, and that's very much how China sees it. That's how all of us see it. I don't know what the new administration will think about that, though.
Let's see. I guess, can I go with you? Yep.
Okay, thank you. I'm Shu Xin, come from China. We are the observer of this conference. And, when it comes to the competition between US and China, especially the technological competition, there is a saying goes in China, also a consensus in China, and that anything that would not kill me will only make me stronger. There is it's a consensus to implicate that the Chinese don't afraid of the U.S. Dumping their advanced technological products into China, but they it's vice versa. Chinese don't afraid U.S. Banned any of the technological access to the advanced technology, but they don't afraid of U.S. dumping the advanced technological products to China, simply because if the U.S. bans China's success to the advanced technology, this would only makes them to develop their own advanced technology. So I wonder how the guest speakers perceive this kind of perspective, and to what extent do you believe that the U.S. would prevail in the competition, the technological competition with China? Thank you.
I'm going to jump on this one because I have a lot of thoughts. I would definitely agree. I think we've already seen that China has benefited incredibly from us ejecting scholars, cutting things off, giving China a reason to develop these domestic industries that they're very capable of doing. Particularly, it used to be that there was a really healthy exchange of students from each country. A lot of the graduate students in computer science in this country got their undergrads in China. And they used to come here and they would study for graduate school. Then they'd stay here. Then they'd start companies. And then they'd develop new technologies. And they were all under the American banner. A lot of those people now are not coming here. They're staying in China. And each of those people individually has the potential of making an idea. What China lacked before was the ecosystem of many minds coming together to innovate. And we had that here. We had many minds from many countries coming together doing these things. We are now making sure that enough people are staying in China at home, that there are many minds sharing ideas, creating things. There's increasing amounts of capital that the government is making available. And I think that when we make these decisions, we are only looking at it in this limited scope of there's so much concern about espionage. They're going to steal our ideas. They're going to steal our patents. And Meta got a lot of flack because Mark Zuckerberg was like, they're going to steal it anyways. We might as well make it open source. And people were like, well, how dare you just give up? Well, I mean, kind of, yeah, like they are going to, at least we used to have that innovation and that energy was here. And I do think China is benefiting significantly from the development of some really interesting domestic ecosystems. And we've already seen like Baidu's models and some of the other major models, they perform at or above the same levels as comparable open source models here in the United States. So, you know, does it matter if they steal our open source models? Not really. I mean, a Chinese language model is going to be preferred in China anyways. And now they have the people to do it. So I would definitely say I wish more people were thinking about that aspect of the decisions that they make.
And
Thank you.
it's a very good question. I mean, I think it's reasonable for a country or for the United States to identify certain technologies, information capabilities that they want to protect or not leave as open for everyone. But as I mentioned in my remarks, that's this small yard idea. And the fact that this definition, or we're expanding this area of everything is some sort of competition with China, I think is a mistake for a variety of reasons. The Biden administration was trying to reassure China with its various measures. We're not trying to undermine the Chinese economy. We want 98% of all of our commerce and trade to keep going as usual. We're just going to protect a few things. I don't think the Chinese leadership really believed that. I think they suspected that there was a broader, and sure enough, you know, as time has gone on, it has gotten broader and broader. So I worry about that from a competitiveness side. Now, I think I'm not worried about losing the competition in the sense that we should all be able to prosper and benefit from these technologies, and we all share this planet, and we have to work together on certain areas. So when I interviewed Japanese companies who were funding research in the United States with universities and other companies in quantum and AI, et cetera, these are initiatives that are they negotiate the intellectual property rules, and if we design something useful, how are we going to manage, you know, they do that. But they publish all the results of their research. So I said, what's the incentive to spend millions and millions of dollars? Why are you coming to the United States to work with Stanford and Cornell and whatever? And they said, even though this basic science or this other science gets published, being a part of the team that actually does it or does the initial work is still really beneficial. It's a second level that's not as good if you're just digesting the information afterwards. So I would argue for, you know, more openness and some restriction. We're all allowed to restrict some things, but it's a very good point that you raised.
Might add just a little footnote, because I think the perspective is what does China see about the US, but I think it's also important to think about what does US see for China, and what are areas that China is rapidly developing where suddenly US thinks, oh, maybe we're falling behind. Nuclear is a really, really good example of that, as China's rapidly developing their nuclear energy production as well as ability to go external. Solar panels is another really good example, and there has been cooperation between US and like Hanwha and other companies to think about how can we also be able to push the label here a little bit in those industries. But those are just two examples that maybe we're looking over there and thinking that we should be doing more on this side and think about that competition. So
Thank you.
All right, I think we are at time, but maybe we could do one more question. Let's see. Oh yeah, I was about to say. Oh my gosh. Okay. Can I maybe in the front row? I think I saw your hand first. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. So I was just curious, earlier, I think someone mentioned that Korea is kind of now at the forefront of AI policy, or that's kind of their like their primary goal right now. But I was just curious, from my understanding, so because the US is currently kind of the leader of AI innovation, that means that the US had some companies who were able to innovate and develop prior to the US placing some sort of ethical and regulation laws and executive orders on AI. So, in that sense, isn't it technically not very beneficial for Japan and Korea to place these sorts of ethical regulations in terms of catching up with the US? Is their government kind of maybe thinking that way from what we know?
Well, I'll take the first blow at this because I think I'm the one who said the AI policy front. And I should clarify, I think what's interesting about Korea when it comes to AI, and I do want to hear from Kellee on some of this, and I know Jim will be able to say more on the Japan side, is that they want to be at the forefront of the conversation. So it's not that they're instituting these sweeping policies. It's that they want to be seen as a hub for conversation debate around the topic. This is very similar to, I think, back with couple presidencies back in South Korea thinking more kind of green tech policy, the green growth initiatives. They wanted to be seen. It's not to say that Korea had the best example of green growth initiative in the entire world, but it was that they wanted to be seen as a hub for it. And this really played into President Yoon's policy around a global pivotal state and thinking of South Korea punching above its weight, being a space where other countries want to convene and discourse and discuss different policy structures. So that's more what I meant when I said they want to lead in the policy side. They want to be seen as a place for platform debate, but obviously they're not the space where the technology is being developed. That's in the United States. So I'd be curious if Jim also has more on the Japan side or Kellee wants to jump in because this is your expertise. So.
Well, I'll just add. So I think, on the AI governance piece, there's kind of two aspects to it. There's a commercial side to it and this national security side. And I think the Hiroshima AI process or the G7, G8 process, along with the OECD, and Partnership for AI, and the UN is beginning to get involved in this as well. And we may have a UN committee similar to Committee on Biodiversity or Committee on Climate Change. It's for true global legitimacy, you're going to need some kind of global initiative, more on the ethical commercial side of trying to harmonize policy. But I think the core groups are the G7, G8 process and the like. California went even a step further and was trying to put a more hard law in place on this front that did not get adopted. That would have had liability aspects to it. And there was criticism that if you do that, people will just leave California and not have that openness to that liability. There's probably truth in that. But I think clearly for our own national security, safety, and for a common platform of commercial activity, does a product do what it says it does? I mean, just from a commercial perspective and a consumer perspective, there will be a multilateral initiative on that front that needs to be played.
I'm going to chime in on the cat out of the bag part of the question. Is it too late to have an ethical standard? And I would say, no, it's not too late. Now, when it comes to data laws, maybe it's too late on some models. These intellectual property questions on, do you have the license to use this data? Nobody was ready for that. Japan had actually made a law, I think in 2019, that said scraping data for AI models is explicitly allowed, no matter whether it's licensed content or not. Now, I think that was decided well before we could foresee a model that could essentially spit out your entire book you're trying to sell for free to a person because your book is in the training set. So, and it's kind of the same thing we're dealing with here. We made a lot of decisions before we really understood what was possible. We did not anticipate large language models being this capable this early. And so we're all kind of dealing with that. So on intellectual property, I would say to an extent, yeah, the cat's kind of out of the bag. And startups knew that. There's an aspect of startup pace that is predicated on if you break the laws, but you do it fast enough that by the time they find you, you're too big and expensive for them to enforce it, then you'll be okay, and that is true. So, but on the ethical thing, I think there's more than enough room for us to say, you know what, we're not comfortable with using emotion recognition technology in large crowds. We're not comfortable with using facial recognition and edge computing on surveillance cameras. We're not comfortable with using algorithms to determine who gets to rent an apartment. We're not comfortable with algorithms that determine the price of apartments. We have that going on in the United States right now. Are you fixing a price if you're a landlord who purchased an algorithm not knowing it was fixing the price? You didn't mean to, but you did. Those standards, once put in place, allow us to then go and say, okay, this model can do this, but you can't use it for that. And if you do use it for that, this is what will happen to you, and this is what we will do for the victims who were infected by this. And I think that's where it becomes very important that countries like these 3 countries align on what's allowed. And I think coming at these surveillance issues, do we want to be able to sweep crowds with surveillance cameras and pull people out of it? Not really. I do not want that. But you know, it doesn't matter if it can. The question is it allowed?
Thank you.
All right. I think with that, and we have some I see coffee in the back of the room if anybody would like any. But before we go to that, thank you so much. I know I learned a lot from you 3. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights. Thank you as well for the great variety of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get out into all of them, but hopefully maybe we can chat a little bit after this or while we're grabbing the coffee I mentioned. So, and with that, yeah, thank you.